notes from Q, which shows and details that the dates they were sent, still listed as in the state of desertion in 1921. So quite a controversial character. But he went on to make under John Ford. He took an exit from Northern Ireland because he got very frustrated by the War of Independence in 1920, and thought this isn't what I fought at Gallipoli for. This isn't what I fought again with the Royal Army Service Corps. And he took the ship to Canada, studied art in Toronto, then art in Paris, where he designed the set and dresses for the Folies Bergère. I don't think there's many people from East Belfast that
there's two.
Put that on their CV. And then art school in New York, and then hitchhiked from New York to Hollywood. He was a painter, and he painted beautiful scenes, church scenes, and all the rest of it. He had a painting in a window, which John Ford wanted to buy and admired it. Came back the next day, but Charlie Chaplin had bought it. So Ford asked who was that man that did that painting. Got introduced to Brian. Brian then became a painter on set. By 1928, he had moved in front of the camera, and Hangman's House in 1928. I'm saying this and it almost sounds unbelievable, but in 1928, he got his first debut in front of the screen alongside an extra. He and this other guy were extras. So who do you think was possibly the biggest star in America, particularly if you like your westerns? Him and John Wayne appeared as extras together, side by side, on the railings, watching a racehorse. I've got the film. Peter, I should have brought it, shouldn't I? I could have actually gone free. Because you go, both of them, you go, that's Brian, that's John Wayne. So, and he kept friends with the Duke, and in his memoirs he talks about going to the Omaha beaches in the 1950s because the Duke's cameraman's son had died on the beaches of D-Day, and they both went and wept over the boy's grave. So they kept in contact. John Ford trained him up. He then moved behind the camera as an assistant director, and then came back to England and set up his own production company. Made 30 films over 4 decades, over 3 continents, and his war film output is absolutely prolific. He kept coming back to war. Mike Caddo, who's Northern Ireland's probably greatest film critic, talks at length about Brian, and he says his war films have a real touch of humanity about them that you will not see in any other war film. So he always focuses on the human side. He'll pick up on close-ups, and so there we go. Possibly, arguably, him and Michael Powell are possibly the UK's 2 greatest war film directors. But I'll leave that. Is there any film buffs, film critics in here? Peter amongst us?
No. I just
so that's not for me to say. But he's been put between. They can't work it out between Brian and Michael Powell. They both together made The Lion Has Wings in 1939, which is the first war film that was out in the Second World War.
It's a falsehood now. Slowly building up the collection.
Have you got Ourselves Alone? Am I allowed to
I
mention
do
Ourselves
have.
Alone? So Ourselves Alone is the literal translation of what? Sinn Féin. So in 1936, it just gives more I'm going down controversy again, aren't I?
You might as well.
1936, he made Ourselves Alone. He said it was pro-British. The Free State said it was pro-British. What did the Unionists do?
I don't know. Belfast.
The only film, it's normally the police boards that censor and ban and oversee what can be shown and when. This was banned by Dawson Bates, basically the Home Secretary at the time, said, not having that film shown here. But we'll show it here one night, and you can decide. I think he actually goes.
This sort of thing.
Down with this sort of thing.
so I think it's worth an airing.
Oh yeah, very much.
It's so it was completely banned here. I was down in the Irish Film Institute a couple of months ago and we screened it. I loved it. It was screened in Queen's Film Theatre in May, packed out during COVID. Every seat sold. So and the funny thing about the banning of it in Belfast was the politicians wrote and said we're to Associated British International Pictures, I think it was. I mightn't have got their title exactly right, but they wrote to the managing director and said we're also worried about safety and damage to the premises. And the film production company wrote back and said, "Don't worry, we own the cinema." So only in Belfast.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of conflict, a lot of war film stuff. So I struggled getting his name out there. I took over the estate in 2009 because he died in testate. And testate means basically there's nothing there and nobody can be bothered because there's nothing there. And I thought, no, there's a good film, there's a good story, there's a good film archive, there's a good literary archive as well. Formalised the estate on behalf of my gran. So Gran worked as a machinist up in Hugh J. Scott's up in Belfast. So she probably wasn't and that's where the estate came down to her and her husband. And so they probably just thought, no, he's a bit controversial, Alan, we'll just leave it. And there's nothing there, we'll just leave it. And I thought, no, there's a thing to rescue here. Formalised the estate, and then since then we've got a good old tick list. If anybody's good on podcasts, 10 years ago I made a documentary for RTE called An Irishman Chained to the Truth, where I start nailing down Brian on some of these tall tales that he told, and start nailing down some of the smoke screens he created, because he was very good at that. So that's on a podcast, RTE Docs on One. It's called An Irishman Chained to the Truth. There's the Directors Guild of Great Britain blue plaque at QFT. There's an Ulster History Circle plaque at the Strand. The Titanic Studios. Everybody picture it.
Mm-hmm.
Paint hall.
Mm-hmm.
And the little flamboyantly painted one beside it. The Hearst soundstage where Game of Thrones was filmed. So that was owned by Deputy, I always get the names mixed up, the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister.
Mm-hmm.
So the two of them came along, and during the speech they argued over whether Ourselves Alone was pro-British or pro. They were just having a banter, but it was funny to watch. So that's named after Brian. So we're getting there. Theirs is the glory stuff. We're getting there with the book, and the big colourful book, which I think Peter had. Got lots of those. The other one's rarer. That one, that was really expensive to produce, but it is. Could you just hold that one up, so folks. So we put that. It's really expensive to produce because I've loaded it with 1,000 images, but we put it on Kindle for £1.49.
Wow.
So
it's £50 to buy the book.
£50 to buy the book.
Not that book.
Yeah.
Alan kindly gave me that book.
So
We're not smuggling that one.
It's okay. My name's on.
So yeah, I've got a couple of those which are in my box, but I can't. They're expensive, folks. They're 50, but I can chuck them out at 30, which is what they cost to produce. But I've only got a couple of them because we didn't do a big production run. But off the back of that, there's some very, very interesting things coming in the future about Brian. I can't talk about it. Can't talk about it.
We'll not tell.
I've been sworn to secrecy. So just wrap it up, then we'll start to watch the film. Brian is recognised. This little kid from Belfast who picked up bread from the street, he's recognised around the world for one film and one film only. Anybody know what it is? Scrooge, A Christmas Carol with Alistair Sim. So the Americans sit down Christmas Eve and they rank it just as high as It's a Wonderful Life. And I love It's a Wonderful Life. I'm in awe of it. I love Scrooge, but they put the two of them in the same box. They'll sit as a family and watch it because it's a story of, if you've had a really bad year, it's I've had a great year. Anybody else not had a good year?
The last 3.
I know. So it's a story of redemption and the turnaround, and life's horrible and it's not going well, and there is hope. So I think that's why it is. So he's known throughout the world, particularly in America. But we're getting there back home. But you know what it's like here with anybody that we've got that's kind of famous. We're not very good at it. What time?
Took a while for the Titanic to catch on.
Took a while. So we're getting there with the recognition, is what I'm saying. And it's probably off the back of Scrooge. But then that gives me the opportunity to tell people, look, have a look at this, have a look at that, have a look at this. So my favourite films are Ourselves Alone, because it was banned. And I think it's great. A Letter from Ulster, which is the American Trips. It's only 35 minutes long. Tom Brown's School Days, I love. I just think it's a real nice romantic, lovely story. And there's a bit of rugby in it, which always gets my attention. Malta Story, simply because it's Alec Guinness really coming through as a straight actor before he was a bit of a comedy actor. I like Malta Story for that. Dangerous Moonlight, I like for the music, the piano concerto. And I love all the little Ministry of Information things that he was doing during the Second World War. He was just pushing out these little things, these little 5-minute segments that you watch in the cinema before the big screening. He's pushing out those, and I think they're great. In fact, you could probably have a night just on Letter from Ulster and those little Ministry of Information shorts. One's about what to do if a German parachuter lands in your back garden. It's 5 minutes.
It's relevant to today.
Well, the Russians come in. Yeah. One was to encourage the women into factories, and it just worked. The factories were besieged by volunteers after they put it out. So this is all Dark Days, 1940, 41. They just worked. And he didn't. So his favourite film, though, of everything that he did, and it's in his memoirs, was Theirs Is the Glory. That was his personal favourite, and he said it was his personal favourite because he's back working with soldiers. And he just loved their company. Took him back to Gallipoli. So we'll watch Theirs Is the Glory. If we're doing a future screening, there's a couple there. But Peter, I don't know, do you go off-piste and not war films, but other films?
Yeah, we're actually doing an Irish. This is our first Irish season.
Okay.
You were talking about controversial films. We have Odd Man Out on Friday. James Mason, almost filmed in Belfast.
So James Mason, Hugh Ashmore, the guy whose photograph you saw, said that they were doing some finishing touches. So Theirs Is the Glory in a studio. They say in the publicity that every single shot was done in Arnhem. But there's a little bit of sneaky stuff they did in the studio. Next door, James Mason was making Odd Man Out.
No.
Hugh Ashmore met Mason in the corridor. Soldiers being soldiers, he wanted a fag and he was out of fags. And Mason came past him and said, "Consider this my piece for the war effort," and gave Hugh a cigarette.